Good morning. I want to begin by saying that what occurred in the early hours of this past week was not, as some have characterized it, a surprise. It was not a shock to those of us who have spent decades studying the architecture of North American economic integration, who have watched with increasing concern the way in which policy decisions made in Washington have strained, tested, and in some cases fundamentally undermined the trust that underpins one of the most consequential bilateral trade relationships in the history of the modern global economy. What happened at 6:23 in the morning was not a beginning. It was an ending. And the distinction matters enormously because how we understand the origins of this moment will determine whether we are capable of responding to it with the seriousness, the discipline, and the long-term strategic clarity that it demands. Let me be precise about what we are discussing because precision is not merely a professional habit for me. It is a moral obligation when the stakes are this high and the public understanding of those stakes is this incomplete. Canada, our largest trading partner, the nation with whom the United States shares not only the world's longest undefended border, but also the deepest web of integrated supply chains, energy infrastructure, financial flows, and defense cooperation that any two sovereign nations have ever voluntarily constructed, Canada made a decision. A formal, deliberate, and I would argue entirely foreseeable decision to sever a critical dimension of its energy export relationship with the United States. And it did so at 6:23 in the morning, which is not an incidental detail. That timestamp tells us something. It tells us that this was not a reactive move made in the heat of a negotiation. It was a pre-planned, carefully sequenced action executed at a time when American markets had not yet opened, when the administrative apparatus in Washington was still in its earliest operational hours, and when the window for immediate response, the kind of measured, coordinated, institutionally grounded response that a decision of this magnitude requires, was, by design, narrow. 40 minutes. That is what the record shows. 40 minutes between the moment Canada's action became formally registered in the channels through which these communications travel and the moment that window for a calibrated diplomatic and economic response effectively closed. I have been in rooms, in the Treasury, at the Federal Reserve, at international summits where decisions worth trillions of dollars were made in compressed timeframes. And I can tell you with full confidence that 40 minutes is not enough time. It is not enough time to convene the relevant principles. It is not enough time to assess the downstream implications across energy markets, currency positions, supply chain dependencies, and the broader macroeconomic landscape. It is not enough time to formulate a response that is proportionate, strategically sound, and diplomatically coherent. And yet 40 minutes was what we had, and we did not use it. That silence, that 40-minute silence that stretched, as silences in moments of crisis always do, far beyond its literal duration, is what I want to examine today. Not to assign blame in the partisan sense, because I do not believe this moment belongs to any single administration's failures alone. The vulnerabilities that Canada exploited, and I use that word carefully, not punitively, but analytically, those vulnerabilities were constructed over years, over administrations of both parties, through a gradual and largely unexamined process of strategic complacency. We told ourselves that the relationship was so deep, so structurally embedded, so mutually beneficial that it was, in practical terms, unbreakable. We confused interdependence with invulnerability. And that confusion has now cost us in ways that will take years and potentially decades to fully quantify. I want to walk through the economic architecture of what was severed on that morning, because I think the public discourse has focused almost entirely on the political dimension, on the personalities, on the rhetoric, on the theater of international relations, and has significantly underweighted the structural economic reality. The energy relationship between Canada and the United States is not, as it is sometimes described, a simple buyer-seller arrangement. It is a deeply integrated system in which Canadian crude oil, natural gas, and hydroelectric power flow southward through infrastructure that was built, financed, and calibrated over generations with the explicit assumption of continuity. Refineries in the Midwest, in Ohio, in Michigan, in Minnesota, in Illinois were constructed or retrofitted specifically to process Canadian heavy crude. They are not easily or quickly reconfigured to process alternative crude grades. The pipeline infrastructure that carries Canadian energy into the American heartland represents hundreds of billions of dollars in sunk capital, and its sudden interruption does not merely create a supply gap. It creates a systems disruption that cascades across refining capacity, fuel pricing, industrial input costs, and ultimately consumer prices in ways that are both immediate and persistent. When I look at the numbers, and I have spent the better part of this week looking at nothing else, the exposure is staggering in its breadth. The United States imports approximately 4 million barrels of Canadian crude oil per day. That is not a figure that can be replaced overnight or over a quarter or potentially even over a year without significant economic disruption. The alternative sources from the Middle East, from West Africa, from Latin America involve longer transit times, different crude grades that require refinery adjustments, higher transportation costs, and in many cases, geopolitical entanglements that introduce their own categories of risk and instability. The notion that the market will simply absorb this disruption and self-correct within a time frame that is politically or economically painless is not supported by the data, and I would be doing a disservice to the American people if I suggested otherwise. What we are facing, in the most direct economic terms I can offer, is a supply shock. And supply shocks, as the economic literature and as lived experience both confirm, are among the most difficult categories of macroeconomic disruption to manage. They are inflationary by nature. They compress margins across the industrial supply chain. They disproportionately burden lower-income households, who spend a higher share of their income on energy and on the goods whose production and transportation costs are directly tied to energy prices. And they arrive, in this case, at a moment when the American economy is already navigating a complex and delicate macroeconomic environment, one in which inflationary pressures have not been fully extinguished, in which the Federal Reserve's path toward its dual mandate remains narrow, and in which the fiscal position of the federal government leaves limited room for the kind of large-scale compensatory intervention that might otherwise cushion the blow. This is the context in which I ask you to hold that 40-minute silence, not as a political failure, though it was that, not as a diplomatic embarrassment, though it was that too, but as an economic event with real, measurable, lasting consequences for real American workers, families, and businesses. The silence was not merely the absence of a response, it was the absence of a strategy. And in the absence of strategy, markets do not wait, they move. They price in uncertainty. They hedge against worst-case scenarios. And in doing so, they can transform what might have been a manageable disruption into something considerably more serious. I will return to the question of what a serious, structured, strategically grounded response looks like. But first, I think it is essential that we understand not just what happened, but why it was allowed to become possible. That requires us to go further back than 6:23 in the morning. It requires us to examine the decisions, the tariff escalations, the rhetorical provocations, the withdrawal from multilateral frameworks, the erosion of the institutional trust that bilateral relationships depend upon, that created the conditions in which Canada concluded that this action was not merely justified, but necessary. That is where part 2 will take us. But for now, I want to leave you with this. What was cut at 6:23 in the morning was not just a pipeline. It was not just a trade flow. It was the assumption of permanence. And once that assumption is broken, rebuilding it requires something far more difficult than any single policy response. It requires the patient, disciplined reconstruction of trust. And that work, that long, unglamorous, institutionally demanding work, begins today. To understand why Canada made the decision it made at 6:23 in the morning, you must be willing to do something that is increasingly difficult in the current political environment. You must be willing to think from the other side of the table, not to agree with every choice, not to endorse every conclusion, but to understand the internal logic of a sovereign nation that looked at its relationship with the United States over the past several years and determined that the costs of continued accommodation had exceeded the benefits of continued patience. That is not a radical conclusion. It is, in fact, the kind of rational economic and geopolitical calculation that nations make when the terms of a relationship shift sufficiently and durably enough that the expected value of maintaining the status quo becomes negative. Canada reached that calculation. And the honest question, the question that I believe history will ask of this period with considerable sharpness, is not why Canada acted, but why we gave them sufficient reason to. Let me begin with tariffs, because tariffs are where this story has its most legible chapter. The imposition of broad based tariffs on Canadian goods, steel, aluminum, lumber, dairy, and eventually a wider basket of manufactured products, was not, as it was sometimes presented, a targeted negotiating instrument deployed with surgical precision against specific unfair trade practices. It was, in its design and its implementation, a blunt instrument that struck at the foundational premise of the integrated North American economic system that had been constructed, refined, and mutually beneficial for decades. The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, and before it, the North American Free Trade Agreement, were not merely trade deals in the conventional sense. They were the legal and institutional expression of a continental economic architecture, one in which supply chains were deliberately designed to cross borders multiple times, in which comparative advantages were deliberately cultivated on a regional rather than a national basis, and in which the elimination of tariff and non-tariff barriers was understood to be not a concession, but a shared investment in collective productivity and growth. When tariffs were imposed on Canadian steel and aluminum, initially justified under national security provisions that Canada, quite reasonably, found both legally dubious and diplomatically insulting, the immediate economic damage was significant but not catastrophic. Canadian producers absorbed some of the cost. American manufacturers who depended on Canadian inputs absorbed some of the cost. Consumers absorbed the remainder. But the deeper damage was not measured in dollars, at least not immediately. It was measured in trust. It was measured in the quiet but consequential recalibration that began occurring in Ottawa, in Canadian boardrooms, in Canadian provincial capitals, as decision makers began asking a question that they had not seriously entertained in a generation. What is the actual reliability of the American economic partnership? And what is the appropriate level of strategic dependence on a partner whose commitment to the terms of the relationship appears to be conditional and revocable? That question, once seriously asked, does not produce comfortable answers, and it produces a policy response that is, from a purely strategic standpoint, entirely rational. Diversification. Canada began with increasing urgency and increasing investment to develop alternative trade relationships. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the United States had withdrawn from, gave Canada preferential access to markets in Japan, Australia, Vietnam, Chile, and across the Asia-Pacific region. The Canada-European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement deepened transatlantic commercial relationships in ways that reduced Canadian dependence on American market access. New pipeline infrastructure directed toward Pacific export terminals began to receive the political and regulatory support that had previously been withheld. These were not hostile acts, they were insurance policies. And the fact that Canada felt the need to purchase them at scale tells you everything you need to know about how the bilateral relationship had come to be perceived in Ottawa. But diversification, however strategically sensible, takes time. Supply chains do not redirect overnight. New trade relationships take years to develop the depth and reliability of those that have been cultivated over generations. And so, even as Canada was building its alternatives, it remained in the short and medium term deeply integrated with the American economy. This created a structural tension that is important to understand. Canada was simultaneously dependent on the United States and actively working to reduce that dependence. And the American response to Canada's diversification efforts, which ranged from indifference to occasional hostility, accelerated the timeline without providing any of the reassurances that might have moderated it. We essentially told Canada, through our actions, if not always our words, that their concerns about reliability were justified, and Canada, being a rational actor, updated accordingly. The rhetorical dimension of this deterioration should not be underestimated, even by those of us who prefer to operate in the domain of data and policy rather than political communication. Words spoken by heads of state and senior officials carry economic weight. They shape expectations. They move markets. They alter the calculus of long-term investment decisions. And the words that were directed at Canada during this period, suggestions that Canada was taking advantage of the United States, accusations of unfair trading practices that were not supported by the empirical record, provocative commentary about the nature of the bilateral relationship that ranged from dismissive to openly antagonistic, these words did not exist in a vacuum. They were heard in Ottawa. They were heard in Canadian corporate headquarters. They were heard by Canadian provincial governments managing resource sectors that had been built on the assumption of American market access. And they produced, over time, a cumulative shift in Canadian political sentiment that made the decision executed at 6:23 in the morning not merely possible, but, from the perspective of Canadian domestic politics, arguably necessary. I want to be careful here because I am aware that this analysis can be read as an apologia for Canadian policy, and that is not my intention. Canada made choices that have imposed real costs on the American economy and the American people, and those costs deserve to be named clearly and addressed seriously. But the premise that Canada's action was unprovoked or irrational or fundamentally hostile in its origins does not survive serious scrutiny. It was, at its root, a response. And responses, however disruptive, must be understood in the context of what they are responding to. Otherwise, we are not diagnosing the problem. We are merely reacting to the symptom while the underlying condition continues to worsen. There is a dimension of this story that I think has been almost entirely absent from the public conversation, and it concerns the institutional frameworks through which disputes of this kind are supposed to be managed. The dispute resolution mechanisms embedded in our bilateral trade agreements exist precisely for moments like this. Moments when one party believes that the other has violated the terms of the relationship in ways that cause material harm. Canada used those mechanisms. Canada brought cases. Canada won cases. And the American response to those legal findings was, in a number of significant instances, to ignore them, to delay compliance, or to reframe the dispute in ways that effectively nullified the practical value of the ruling. This is not a minor procedural matter. The credibility of a rules-based trading relationship depends entirely on both parties' willingness to be bound by the rules, including when those rules produce outcomes that are politically inconvenient. When one party demonstrates, repeatedly and publicly, that it views the rules as optional when they cut against its interests, the other party draws the only reasonable conclusion available to it, that the rules cannot be relied upon and that alternative mechanisms of protection must be developed. The alternative mechanism that Canada developed and has now deployed is leverage. Energy leverage specifically, because energy is the dimension of the bilateral relationship in which Canada's structural position is strongest and American vulnerability is most acute. This is not a new insight. Canadian policymakers have understood this leverage for decades. The decision to exercise it is what is new. And the decision to exercise it now, at this particular moment, in this particular way, reflects a judgment on Canada's part that the accumulation of grievances has reached a threshold beyond which continued restraint is no longer strategically rational or domestically sustainable. That judgment may prove to have been correct. It may prove to have been premature, but it was not made carelessly and it was not made without warning. The warnings were there in the diplomatic record, in the public statements of Canadian officials, in the pattern of policy responses that Canada deployed as each successive escalation from Washington arrived without the reciprocal de-escalation that a functioning bilateral relationship requires. What does this history demand of us now? It demands, first and most urgently, an honest accounting. Not a political accounting, not a blame allocation exercise designed to score points in a domestic debate, but a genuine, clear eyed assessment of the choices that were made, the consequences that followed, and the structural vulnerabilities that those choices revealed. It demands that we resist the temptation to frame this as a simple story of Canadian aggression or American victimhood, because that framing, however politically convenient, is analytically false and strategically paralyzing. And it demands that we begin the work of understanding what a reconstructed bilateral relationship would need to look like. What institutional architecture, what dispute resolution mechanisms, what mutual commitments and mutual constraints would be necessary to rebuild the foundation of trust that has been eroded. That work is not simple. It is not fast, and it cannot be accomplished through the kind of transactional, short horizon negotiating posture that has characterized too much of American trade policy in recent years. It requires a strategic patience that is difficult to sustain in a political environment oriented toward immediate results and visible victories. But the alternative, a prolonged period of economic disruption, elevated energy costs, supply chain fragmentation, and geopolitical estrangement from our closest neighbor and most deeply integrated economic partner, is far more costly than the discipline that strategic patience requires. In part three, I will turn to the immediate economic consequences that are already beginning to materialize and to the policy tools that are available to us as we navigate this disruption. But the foundation for any effective policy response must be the honest historical understanding that I have tried to lay out here. Without that understanding, we will respond to this crisis the way we have responded to too many crises before, reactively, inadequately, and in ways that address the surface while leaving the underlying structure intact and vulnerable. Let me turn now to the immediate economic consequences, because whatever the historical context, whatever the diplomatic failures that brought us to this moment, the American people are not living in the historical record. They are living in the present. They are filling their gas tanks, heating their homes, running their businesses, managing their payrolls, and making the thousands of daily economic decisions that collectively constitute the lived reality of a national economy. And those decisions are being made as of this morning in an environment that has materially changed from what it was 72 hours ago. The price signals are already moving. The market positioning is already shifting. The supply chain adjustments that businesses are being forced to contemplate are already consuming the time, the capital, and the strategic bandwidth of executives and operators across the industrial Midwest and beyond. The consequences are not theoretical. They are not projected. They are present, they are measurable, and they are, in several important respects, worse than the baseline scenarios that even the most cautious analytical frameworks had prepared us for.